All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Phil Taratko. It's June 1st, 2022 with Nicholson Library at Linfield University. Phil, thanks so much for joining us today. First question to get you started is why wine?
First off, thank you very much for having me as well. I appreciate being here. So why wine? That was one I was ready to prepare to answer. What I find so intriguing about wine is it's a contradiction of like a lot of different things. It's kind of high and low culture. It's agriculture. It's luxury culture. It's manual, physical labor. At the same time, it's very intellectual. There's a very scientific, quantifiable piece of it, but then there's also a very kind of subjective, artisanal artistry kind of piece of it as well. I think I've always been attracted towards these kind of contradicting, difficult things to put into a box, and I think wine very much kind of encompasses all of that. It's also global, which is really cool. You can find it on almost all continents, and lots of different cultures, and everybody needs to eat and sleep and drink, and I think wine fits very closely into those kind of basic needs.
Like that, contradictions. That's a new one for us. I don't think we've heard anybody describe it quite that way. So tell me about kind of life before wine. Where did you grow up, and how did you find your way into wine?
So I grew up in the suburbs of New York City, between Long Island and Connecticut. Long Island is a wine region, you could say, but not where I was living. When I was 18, I had the opportunity to come out to the Northwest for university at the University of Oregon. And it seemed like a good opportunity to kind of go far from home and try something very different. Through school, I had an opportunity to go to France, to Lyon in France, which is the capital of gastronomy. And while I was living there, I lived there for a year. I had this dream of becoming a chef and going to the Institute of Paul Bocuse. And so I came back to the U.S. to finish school, thinking that was going to be the path, and then started working in restaurants, actually like beer specific restaurants, and realized that the life of a chef is not quite as glamorous as it may seem from the outside. I ended up doing like the Cicerone test, which is kind of like a sommelier equivalent for the world of beer. Lots of attention to sensory elements. In a very, very long story short, had an opportunity to work in a tasting room. Things kind of rolled from there. I think you had interviewed one of my mentors, Ray Walsh. And Ray kind of gave me a really awesome opportunity to do the tasting room, and then at the same time his assistant winemaker had moved on to a little bit more of he was a little bit older than me, kind of in a position where he needed a little more security in his job, moved on to a kind of bigger winery, and I had the opportunity to start helping in production, and that's kind of where the wine journey began from there.
So food and then beer and then wine, kind of in that order.
Yeah.
What excited you about food and beer before wine? What was exciting to you about gastronomy in those times?
I think I don't come from a family of particularly like adventurous food people. We're very like meat and potatoes type folk, and I think going to France and living there and just really like immersing myself in the culture. Food is an incredibly important piece of like all aspects of culture. We had this. My wife is French, so I can like joke a little bit about French people. But we joke about how like if you want to learn French, you really just have to learn to talk about food, and that's like a good percentage of the conversations that are important is what's at the table, and you'll be at the table and you talk about what you ate yesterday and what you're gonna have tomorrow. And it really becomes this kind of glue glue of society and culture in a lot of ways, because like in France and in many countries, not just in France, but the family unit is based around the table, and social interactions occur around food. I think many folks would argue that alcohol is social lubricant, and I think you quickly see where wine plays a role in all of that. And I think, getting into beer first, I think beer is a very similar kind of a similar domain. People really pay attention to the sensory aspects. There's definitely a craft behind it. Wine may or may not be debatably older. Depends on who you're talking to. Depends on what countries you're using as reference points. But I think just this culture around like consuming food and breaking bread and enjoying food and drink with people was where the intoxication of it all kind of began.
What was your sort of introduction to wine? What was you mentioned working in a tasting room. Was that the first real introduction you'd had to wine, or did you have some knowledge before that?
Yeah, I think, so I moved to France when I was 20. I turned 21 in France, which is when you're an American university student in school, because you skip a year. You don't have to wait till 21. And it was interesting because I realized in France, wine is so embedded in the culture that even, teenagers have some sort of understanding of wine. In France, it's much more common for you to give, not like a child, but a young teenager to taste wine, and for it to not be quite so taboo as maybe it is in American culture. And I started to realize when you go to friends' houses for dinner and whatnot, like the wine was a really big deal. Even when you're 20 years old and you get invited to your friend's house and it's your responsibility to get the wine, you got to pick a good wine. And you go to the store for the first time and you see all these different bottles, and in France and in Europe they don't label bottles the same way as we do in America, where we have the grape varietal, the year. We're very categorical in the US, and in Europe things are based by place, and there's a lot of context that you need to know to really understand the wine. And you start to realize that it's this really big world, and so you start with the basics. I think most people start with red wines from Bordeaux, and I think that's a really good entry point for a lot of people. It's often when you're looking for good wine at a reasonable price, those wines are often right in that area. And then, you start tasting a bunch of wines, and the more you taste, the more you get an idea of what you like, and then you just start down this kind of rabbit hole. But that moment, I think my first exposure was when we get invited to dinner. Everyone has a responsibility. One person is cooking, one person is going to do the dishes. My French friends always thought it was funny to give the American the wine decision, and the pressure came on me, and ultimately it was a very cool position to be in. And you get put in this position where you have to make the decision, and if you make a bad decision, everyone's going to let you know about it. and what's cool about it too is it's not just right or wrong. There's a lot more elements to it, and maybe it was a good wine, but it didn't match well with what you're eating. Maybe somebody's got a story. Oh, I know that place. My grandfather did this and that. At one point, my roommate, who was from Jura, which is a kind of older wine region, he would go back every weekend and visit his grandfather, and his granddad would give him food and wine to bring back to our apartment. So every Sunday night, we'd have this like big feast, and that was a big way I got to discover all these different bottles that were not chosen by me, and therefore, came with a little bit more of a guarantee of quality.
So, tell me about your first wine job, then your first tasting room job. What did you think of it, and what did you have to learn, or what did you learn in it?
So I think to give credit where it's due, I think the beer position that I worked in was really good in helping me get to the wine tasting room. In that it was the place I was working it's in Eugene, really well known place. They have like 24 taps, tons of microbreweries, and constantly rotating taps, all the different styles of beers, and you start to learn that people are very particular about things, and you can start to gauge and learn what questions to ask people, and then how to tailor their decisions of what they might drink from there. And then when you switch to the wine tasting room, it's a similar role. You start to, you can ask people what they like, what kind of flavor profiles they like, and then you start to, figure out where they might find themselves on the tasting flight and what might be of interest to them. To give credit to Ray Walsh, Ray is from New Zealand and has lived in Oregon for like the past 25, 30 years, and he goes back and forth and makes wine in both places. And so that was a really cool position to be in, because I got to like present wine from two different places, and it was the same winemaker, the same grape varietals. And so they say the best way to learn is to teach someone else. It instills it in how you figure it out. And when you talk about wine and you explain wine to a bunch of people and they ask really good questions and it makes you formulate how you're going to respond, I think that was the start of starting to get a real understanding of wine in particular.
What did you think of the kind of the retail side of beer and wine and the sort of the public service of it? How did that sort of fit for you? What did you enjoy about it?
So I've done sales for a long time. I worked in shoe stores since I was like 15 until 21, basically. So I was familiar with sales. It's like the best and the worst. It all depends on the customer. You get folks that are, it's customer service. You get folks that come in and they're having a bad day and they're gonna, put that onto you. And then you have folks that like have never really had a serious conversation about wine, and then you get to be the curator for that initial discussion. And those were the really valuable kind of conversations. And and I think we're in a university right now. I think there's a lot to be said about like not naivety in a negative sense, but approaching something without a preconceived notion about it. I think you ask really, really honest questions, and when you're in a tasting room scenario and you get folks that maybe don't know a lot about wine but are very attentive and observant, I think you get asked really good questions, and then you start looking at it from a different kind of perspective.
Tell me about your own wine education. You mentioned the best way to learn is to teach, and that's so true. How long did it take you to feel comfortable in a role of understanding wine well enough to teach it or to talk candidly about it?
Yeah, I think it comes slowly, and working in a tasting room is interesting because you're really presenting like one product, and so the more you present, it's like at any given time you might have 6 to 8 wines that you're pouring, right? So you can pretty quickly get the learning curve of those wines. You start to see how people react. You can in a short period of time learn that really quick, and then what you realize is when people start coming in and they may not know your wine, so you have a lot to tell them about the wine that you're pouring, but then they also have their own reference of wine in general. That's when you start to see, the world start opening up, and realizing that, in order to be a good sommelier or tasting room person, it's not just about knowing what you're pouring, it's also about knowing, the world of wine. Mm-hmm. And then you fall into the trap of many people who get hooked on wine, and, there's always more to learn, there's more regions to understand, there's more styles, you start the educational mountain climbing, if you will.
Tell me about the transition then into production. What was that? Was that something you were looking for, or something you kind of more fell into?
Yeah. So I remember I worked at the beer bar for about a year, and it was during my senior year of university, and then the year after following. And I remember having this bar life. You go to sleep really late, you wake up really late, you end up hanging out with just people that work in bar life. And I remember having this like epiphany at like 22 and realizing that maybe like 21 something in the early 20s, and realizing that I was like, man, if I don't do something physical now, I might not later in life have the opportunity to do physical work. So that was something interesting. I thought for a while, I was like, maybe I'll just do construction or something. I had a very unique situation where, I'll try and keep it brief, but I was living in an apartment building, there was this thing that happened in Eugene where a property management company went under, and a lot of people who owned their apartment buildings had to then manage them themselves. And it was a very old apartment complex. We had a very non-responsive management company that ultimately went under, so I did some of the repairs in the apartment. And the owner came, this was like kind of mid to late in my senior year at university, and like introduced himself to all the tenants and said he was going to meet, going to start managing it himself. And I showed him some of the repairs I had done on the house, and he was like, "Oh, like, do you want to manage the apartment?" And I was young 20s, coming out of school, not had a lot of money, and the opportunity to like work for my rent was a really good opportunity, and it also allowed me to do some of these physical things. So that came first, and just doing like little repairs and stuff, or meeting with the plumbers or the electricians, and just kind of like chaperoning and learning from those guys. And so that the interest for the kind of physical maintenance and repairing things kind of began, and then the wine opportunity came, and it just seemed to fit right into that. You're working with pumps, you're dealing with tanks, everything's three-phase in a winery, things that you learn fixing a toilet or a sink and plumbing in a house, it has to do with liquid dynamics when you're filling tanks and moving wine around. So yeah, it was in retrospect, it's funny how it all lines up like that, but one thing kind of led to another, and the production aspect to me was really intriguing too, because the more you have authority, not at that point, I wasn't making decisions in the winery necessarily, but the more you have authority and the more you're involved in the production process, the better you are at selling it too, right? When somebody asks you about the wine, it's like you were there, you did all the processes for it. And then I had a great experience. My very first harvest, so I started, I want to say in January, working in the tasting room, and then...
What year was this?
This was 2015. Started working in the tasting room and doing a lot of the tasting room stuff, and then you start doing like the way to work your way into wine labeling, like Mr. Miyagi, you want to be a kung fu master, you wax the car. If you want to be a winemaker, you like paint the walls and you label bottles and you do all the meticulous things that the person who's really focused on the winemaking doesn't really want to deal with. You got to earn your stripes like any industry out there. And so I started doing those things. I started helping with the bottlings, helping with rackings, cleaning tanks, which is an obvious one. There's a lot of not glorious parts of winemaking, but in retrospect, there's actually like a really beautiful piece about it too. But anyway, so the first harvest came in that September. It came a little earlier than expected, and Ray, my mentor, had a sales trip already planned to Alaska, and so he had left, and the first fruit came in when he wasn't there. And I had never worked harvest before, and all of a sudden the fruit came in, and I was, dealing with it. And it was one of those like sink or swim scenarios, and all praise due to Ray. Super cool guy, and I think he probably had confidence in me to do the right things and whatnot, but really put me in a position where, it was like, okay, you do it. And I was calling him like every day, 5 times a day, and the chiller of the winery turned off for some reason. There's all the things that happen when it's the first time, and when you do something for the first time, this tiny little error seems like this massive earthquake. And so yeah, it was a very quick involvement in the production, and then we worked that whole harvest as 2 people. I think we did 198 tons, which is like a lot, and it's that it's a really good facility they have down there. It's pretty well equipped, but that's a lot. And it was a very big testing moment. I remember like later in the harvest having a moment of like hour 62 or something like that in the week, and just like being like, Ray, I don't know if I can do this, and him being I'm sure I know he's mentored many young winemakers, and he just kind of coached me through it, and yeah, you just kind of do. And I think that's the addicting part of the winemaking crush season, is you just do. And that may be a piece that isn't always explained to the customers, is that, there's an ideal and then there's a practicality, and the winemaker's gift is to make those two things run parallel. And then, you open your eyes and it's 3 months later and you just worked for God knows how many hours, and it's a bit of an addicting kind of thing. I think winemakers are very compulsive, kind of OCD kind of folks. You want to control everything, but the reality is it's wine and it's agriculture and it's nature, and you can't control everything.
There's something appealing about the thought of not really being able to think. Just being able to do and react. Right? Yes,
and like we said earlier, the contradictory piece of it, is you have a plan, but that you're not going to follow the plan. It's impossible to follow the plan. If you wrote down everything you're going to do in harvest and then the grapes start coming in, it's impossible to have it dialed in like that. And I think that's one of those awesome contradictions. Is it is intelligent and it's also physical, and then you have to make decisions on the fly. One piece of advice that Ray gave me, and it really sticks and I think applies to many more things than just winemaking, is winemaking is a series of decisions, and you need to follow the thread of decision making. So if you started making decisions early in the process because you had one thing in mind, you can't undo that later. You need to follow the same stream, the same direction that you had in the beginning, and evolve and react according to what's in front of you. But you have to have some kind of fluency. Otherwise, you pull your hair out going crazy and trying to undo and redo. And I think on many big projects in life, that is important advice, because there's infinite different ways to achieve things, and when you start in one facet, you often have to just continue.
That's a pretty unique first harvest experience. Tell me what you get done with harvest. You finally have a chance to stop and breathe a little bit. What were you kind of thinking at that point? Was it still something that you were excited to do again, or were you thinking what else can I do besides that ever again?
Yeah, I sat down with Ray and I was like, you need to make me assistant winemaker and I need a business card. Ray, being the awesome guy that he is, he did it. And I think that was a crucial moment of if that didn't happen, then I don't know if I was going to continue with it. It was just, when you put so much of yourself into something, you want to see something come back from it. And it was a very unique situation. Often when you start at a winery, you're a cellar hand and there's a team of folks, and then it just being myself and Ray, it was, for myself, was a wonderful experience. You're working directly with the person who's calling all the shots, and there's no filter of information. You're getting it straight from the source. But also it's, a difficult situation where, it's right on you and there's no one to fall back on, or, if you're not sure how to do it and Ray's not there at that moment, you have to do something, So, I was like, I need to be assistant winemaker. And so it was a very quick promotion to assistant winemaker. And I owe a lot of credit to Ray for putting me in a position where that could happen. It was scary and crazy, and I don't know. I think a lot of times in your early 20s, you're almost looking for something to really hold on to, and the water ski, you grab the line and you ski, and the wine was the boat.
So how did that change your approach, if at all? Now that you got a business card now and everything.
Yeah.
How did it kind of change maybe your approach, or maybe your perception of what was going to come next?
Yeah, definitely. With a business card and a title, it brings authority and ownership over. So now when you're back in the tasting room and you're a young guy working in the tasting room, or a young girl, you're a young person working in the tasting room, sometimes I remember there's this one lady, I'll never ever forget it. And this, I'm sure anyone's worked in customer service can relate to this. And this woman just walks in, and she was probably have visited several other wineries that day. And she just walks in and looks at me, and I was 22 or 23. And she's like, I've been drinking wine longer than you've been alive. And what I wanted to say, what I didn't say, is that means you're an alcoholic. That doesn't mean you know wine, And I didn't, because, in customer service, you got to just let things roll, and you just, diffuse situations and push things in the way you're trying to go. But that was something that would kind of occur, not often, but you have to prove yourself to folks. When they come into a place for an educational experience and you don't look like you might have the ownership over what you're doing, you have to prove it. And having a title was a really big piece for me, and when people are like, well, who are you? What's this kid doing here? I'm like, well, actually, I'm the assistant winemaker, and I work with Ray, and Ray and I did all these things together, and it puts you in a role where you can have ownership over what you do, and it gives you a lot of credibility.
So what came next then? You're assistant winemaker. What came next for you?
Yeah, started. I think many folks who work in small wineries will have this experience of you wear all the hats, right? Kind of a typical small winery scenario, husband and wife business, they break up the different roles, whether it be managing the tasting room, doing events, doing the winemaking. And so I found myself in this position where I'd just be like changing clothes all the time. And you go to the winery, you do rackings, you clean the tanks, change your clothes, put on a nice shirt, go to the tasting room, sell wine for the evening. So doing those two things all the while, still doing the property management stuff, which was cool because wine isn't always the most lucrative business in the world. So having other like hustles on the side can really help you sustain. And yes, continued in that role for almost 3 years. Wow, that's really like brushing things together. But yeah, just continue working with Ray, continued, learning from the mentor, working with his wife as well, who handled a little bit more of like the business kind of customer service side of things. Ended up doing all different, the winemaking, but then, painting the floor of the tasting room and doing little repair work around. And I think that's something that a lot of winemakers love about the job, is it's a very dynamic thing. And I think anybody who works for a small business, that's just part of it. You have to be dynamic. You have to be willing to do whatever it takes to keep the business rolling. So it turned into like doing wine club management, which was not my favorite thing at all. But it's totally necessary because if it's another Ray Walsh quote, it's easy to make it, it's hard to sell it. And like any small business, you can have a brilliant idea and be really good at what you do, but if you can't monetize it, you can't sustain the business. And so that was a really important piece for me to learn as well. Was you can put your head down and do the work really well, but if you can't articulate that to somebody why the product has value, then you're not going to be doing what you do all that long. You have to have the understanding of the business piece of it as well. So it's a little bit of an apprenticeship in everything, in life, in production, in business, in small business. I think that's something to speak specifically on Oregon. I think there's a lot of small wineries here, and I think that's really cool. And that's like the heart of why people fall in love with wine, is the charm of the small business. And I don't know that if I was in a different place that I might have been able to access as much information, as much education as I accessed as quickly. It was a rather quick projectile into the world of wine.
Tell me about your sort of the build for your sort of skills and confidence in those kind of years with Ray. How did you feel like, say, tell me about your second harvest. What was different about the second harvest?
Yeah, I think the third one is where it really sticks. Because number one is like you're just trying to do, right? And if you've achieved what you needed to do, then wow, like pat on the back. Second harvest is you're just trying to put things in order, and you're like, okay, I remember doing this, and then we did this after, and so you're just trying to like situate the big macro view of things. And then I think to me the third one is where you start to critically analyze the decisions and be like, okay, we did this because of that. I remember 2 years ago we did this, but that's because the fruit looked like that. So yeah, it's it doesn't all come at once, definitely. But I think the third one is where you start to, or for me at least, is where you start to understand a little more of the decision-making process versus just like how. You know, you have to learn how before you learn why, right? And yeah, so number 2 was just putting things in order. And yeah, number 3, we got a good friend of mine, just traveled the world, came back, was looking for a gig, and I kind of hooked him up with the gig working with Ray and myself. And that was cool because, like we said before, the best way to learn is to teach. And now I got to like have someone else on the team who was just learning and try and explain things to him while he was asking really good questions. And I think that's where the things started to solidify for me.
So you mentioned you were there for about 3 years. What comes next?
Yeah, next came like the end of early 20s crisis of you're like, what am I doing and am I going to keep doing this? And so as I mentioned, Ray is from New Zealand. I like knew that going to New Zealand to work harvest was like maybe something that was possible, but I wasn't totally sure. I had a girlfriend for a while. We had just broken up. You're inevitably questioning everything about your life when those things kind of happen. And I had a moment where I'm from New York. Everyone I grew up with is all in New York City, more or less. And I had this moment of like, all right, I'm just gonna move back to New York. And like, if I have to work in a wine shop somewhere, I'll just do that, you know. And at that moment, because everything happens the way it happens, that was right at the moment where Ray offered me the opportunity to go abroad and work for his partner in New Zealand and be the assistant winemaker there. And it all happened very, very quickly. I ended up leaving the position as property manager in order to go do that. And I got a position as assistant winemaker moving to New Zealand. And so kind of moved down there in the beginning of 2018 and had the job set up. They offered me a car when I got there. They're like the nicest people in the world. Shout out Luke Cowley and Kate Cowley and their whole family. And yeah, it was another position where I was the assistant winemaker for one winemaker, and another really valuable educational piece where you have that direct connection to the person making the decisions. And the other circle of this whole story is that Luke had actually apprenticed under Ray prior to me working for him. So, you know, like any industry, things are, what's the word? Inbred is not the right word. Incestual, that's even a little bit harsh. But yeah, everybody knows everybody, you know, and I think like most things out there, you know, you get places by doing right by people and then them opening doors for you and, you know, following the path. And you don't always know where it's going to go. But yeah, so started working, and that was an interesting experience as well. We were a very small, originally the facility that we're working at was a very large co-op, and it was a lot of small wineries renting space from the co-op because owning wine equipment is super expensive. It makes way more sense if you have a lot of people splitting that cost. And then over time, the owner company of the facility realized that it was more lucrative for them to just make all the wine themselves and then sell it as different brands. And so we were in a really unique position where we were the last of the small wineries on this like mega facility. So I believe we did 350 tons, give or take, and the facility itself did like 250,000 tons. It was huge, you know, I've never seen wine production like that ever. And so it was really unique because we were this little corner of the giant, you know, campus facility that it was. They had like, I think 115 interns working there, and we were just a very, very small little piece. But what was really cool is we're doing this really small artisanal winemaking right next to this very, very large production industrial winemaking. And again, for myself, was a really valuable learning experience of seeing these two different sides of things. And, you know, making wine in large scale, I think often gets like villainized in the world of wine, but I think to be totally fair, there's a lot of skill involved in that. And particularly in the modern, in like the 2022 wine world, I think we like villainize a little bit the use of additives in wine and very scientific winemaking maybe. And I think there's a skill in making like 1 million cases of a wine that's like very drinkable and enjoyed by people all over the world. And I think that credit is due to folks who are able to do that and reproduce a wine over and over and over that is enjoyable and that will be consumed. So it was interesting. You get to see all the different styles, the different sizes. I remember going into the dry goods facility of that major production operation, and like it's a warehouse bigger than the winery I was working in of just additives, bentonite and sulfur and charcoal and yeast food and thousands of different yeast, and it's just like it's what's the word? It's impressive to see that, and then you also see the other piece where in the new world, we have created 2 roles very much. We've created like viticulture and winemaking, and I think in the old world, those roles are the same, but like anything, in order to industrialize and capitalize on things, you have to segment, and so we've created like growers and winemakers. And what's interesting is, and a little bit disenchanting for myself to learn, was often at like the larger facilities, the winemakers didn't really have much to do with like the making of the wine. It was much more the decision making, absolutely. But it wasn't the winemaker that was racking the tank, or actually making the blend. They were the ones that were making the decisions, obviously. But like, you would send somebody to get the samples. They bring the samples. You taste the wines. You write up the job order. You send it to the cellar manager. The cellar manager gives it to the cellar hand. It gets done by the chain of command. And that was an interesting thing to see as well. Is looking at myself early in my career, seeing different ways of like maybe success or how to move up in the world, and that is certainly one of them, to go to a larger winery and be responsible for the production of lots of wine. And I think what a lot of people in that position find is they do that, and then they also have their little like heart project that gets a lot of love and attention, and everything gets a lot of attention. That's not to discredit the larger quantity wines. Interesting to be young and see all these different sides of the industry and try and envision like where do I go, where do I fit in all of this. So that was really cool. And then to continue here, the winemaking season slows down. Things are getting ready for bottled. In New Zealand, a lot of the white wines are bottled within 6 months of being picked. And so the winery season ends. As I mentioned, they're like the coolest family ever. They offered me a position to stay in the vineyard. And so it was a 72 hectare vineyard. This was another funny one where the stars just worked out the right way. So I got hired initially as, I think I was called a vineyard technician. I like that term. That was a nice title to have. But basically, man, you drove tractor. The funny thing in all, again, Kiwis or people from New Zealand have an awesome cultural attitude of like, you can do it. It's fine, you can do it, and they have this one saying, and I won't say it in the Kiwi accent to not offend anybody, but they have a saying, and it's like, she'll be right. And what it means is like, she'll be all right. Like, you'll get it done, it's fine. And it's often this situation of like, they hired me to be a tractor technician, and I was like, I've never driven a tractor before. And they're like, oh, you can figure it out, And so anyway, I got hired as like the younger, or not the younger necessarily, but the junior technician, and then a month into the job, the senior left, and then I got pushed up again. So one of those kind of, the stars just aligned, and that was an amazing experience in seeing how, and this is larger because we're talking about 70 hectares, which in Oregon is a fairly big operation. In New Zealand, it's not really that big of an operation at all, but it was like really interesting to see how larger vineyard management works. And then, you spend 55 hours a week driving a tractor, and you get a very different perspective on life. My joke with my wife, who I met in New Zealand, is, it's life at 4 kilometers an hour. And you get a very different perspective of things when you're going that slow. And then, even when you're doing things by hand in the vineyard, wire lifting or shoot thinning or whatever, it's a very different perspective when you're working things like vine by vine, and then you get in that winemaker crush mode of you just do, and then all of a sudden you look at it and you're like, wow, the day's done, and you look back and you're like, oh, I did all those roasts right there, and it's an interesting an interesting perspective as well.
So were you at that point thinking you might stay in New Zealand? Was that something that was becoming a possibility?
So that has a lot to do with my wife as well, who's not my wife at the time, but we had met almost immediately upon getting there. If anyone goes and does a harvest in Marlborough, New Zealand, Blenheim is like the town that people like, if you work in Marlborough, you've had some sort of interaction in Blenheim. It's very, very small. You meet everybody very quickly. It's this really interesting culture because it's a very like rural New Zealand society, but at the same time, there's tons and tons of young folk that come over from South America, from Europe, from North America to work harvest, and like a lot of people that just backpack. So you have this really interesting like dichotomy of people of like an agricultural society blended with like a very young cosmopolitan kind of European-based society, and it's just this really interesting mesh of people. You meet everybody very quick. I met my wife. The folks at the vineyard I was working with offered to keep me on, and the deal was it was either a 3-year, I believe, or a 5-year visa, and we had to prove a couple things. Like any visa process is not totally straightforward, but they were committed to giving me that opportunity. At the time, my not yet wife was changing jobs, and her job was also linked to her visa, and we had a moment where it was like we both were going to be without a visa and to renew, and we had this really critical decision to make of like, okay, do we commit to this? Because the people I was working for were awesome people, the people she was working for were awesome people, and we knew we didn't want to make a commitment that we weren't going to follow through with. And so our opinion was like it was best to either, go ahead and go all in on it, or if we're going to leave, to do it right then. We were looking at Melbourne, Australia as an option. I honestly don't know why. The United States was an option too. Another piece that plays into it is currency exchange rates. We were both getting paid very well for what we did, and we both had like really good positions for where we were at. But when my wife is French or grew up in France, and her family's all in Europe, my family's mostly on the East Coast of the U.S. And when you make your money in a different country that has a less strong a dollar, to come back and visit your family in other countries puts you in a really tough position. We did the math. Basically, we would have had 3 weeks vacation a year where we go visit our families, come back, and we start from zero every year. And we're like, that's not a very sustainable model. So that also played into it. And we were like, well, maybe we should just roll the dice and come back to Oregon. And I really had a lot of love for the Northwest. I had worked there and lived there for 7 years almost by that point. 6 years, something like that, and knew I had some connections that could probably help us stay afloat. And so we decided that the Northwest was where we were going to go. And that was the beginning of 2019 that we moved back to the Northwest.
Just in time. Just in time,
and really just in time, because had we stayed in New Zealand during COVID and whatnot, it would have been a really, really difficult position to be in. New Zealand in some sense is very isolated, just being an island in the middle of the Pacific, but then during COVID and whatnot, it was very, very isolated. I think that would have wore on us in a tough way. So really just in time. And it also gave us a year to figure our stuff out in the US before COVID happened, which was a crucial year because, during COVID and whatnot, the whole job market flipped on its head. Nobody knew. The beginning of COVID was crazy, right? The whole world was ending. The sky was falling. And so it gave us a year to like at least build a little bit of a base before the sky fell,
So at that point, you had done a little bit of everything. I mean, you'd been in retail, and you'd been in production, you'd been in the vineyard. Were you looking for something in particular when you came back to Oregon?
Yeah, I knew the wine that was where I probably wanted to end up ultimately. though I didn't know how to immediately do it. Like I had moved to New Zealand with the job already set, so I went to Australia for a month. I like did all these things before knowing that where I was going to land, I had something set. And when we moved back to Oregon, we had nothing set, and so that was a very difficult young decision. But like everything is important, and it forms you how you do things later on. But that was kind of tough, and something that's interesting in Oregon is like the cannabis industry is a really big industry as well. And being in the Eugene area, I had always known people in the cannabis industry. And funny enough, when we first got back here, that was like the first job available to us, was like doing hemp work, which is like super not glorious, doesn't really pay that well, but it pays, and we had a job, and that was important. And then another funny way things fell, they were expanding, they were planting fields. They just bought a tractor, but nobody knew how to drive it. And I was like, man, I just spent 60 hours a week for 6 months on a tractor, like pay me to do it. And then that happened, and that really saved us at a really crucial moment. My not yet wife had to go back to France because of visa things. You can only stay for so long. So thank you to the cannabis guys for holding it down in a very important moment where, things weren't very stable. And then while my wife was in France, I started to, I think I went to Napa at some point. I did the sommelier certification, just thinking, I don't have a formal education in wine, and just thinking it was something to have on the CV. It was just one more, certified, acknowledged piece to have. So I went ahead and did that, and that was a really cool experience as well. I'd done a little of the sales, done a little production, but that's a very specific niche. And it's interesting when you spend a lot of time around winemakers, and then you go and hang a lot around sommeliers, and you realize vocabulary is different. What is important is different. You talk about wine in different ways. Like the way you value things is different. So that was cool for me, just as a more wholesome understanding of wine to get that piece. And then doing the hemp thing. Started taking interviews and just going around, and met some folks. Another shout out, Olivier Woshola, who you just recently interviewed at Petit Monde Wine. I had met him right when we moved back because somebody met my wife and I and was like, "Oh, you're French, you gotta meet Olivier." And Olivier is the coolest, most generous, sincere dude ever. And I met him first, and he didn't really have a job or anything to offer, but he immediately just opened his connections up to me and was like, "Oh, I import wine, so I don't know many people in production, but here, go meet with this person." And I ended up taking an interview with somebody Olivier put me on with. And then that person was like, "We're really just looking for somebody to drag hoses around. I don't think you're really going to be satisfied with this." And then he pointed me to the Beckhams, Andrew and Andrea Beckham, who I think you also have interviewed, and was like, "I think they are in a need of somebody." And so then my not yet wife was in France, and I went to the Beckhams and gave my CV, and I was like, "I know you guys didn't advertise anything, but that guy told me," Drew at JK Carrier, thank you, Drew, that you guys might need help. And so I pitched it to them, and I was like, "I've done the whole small winery thing, I've done the wine club, I've done the production, basically you need me." And Andrew and Andrea are very awesome people as well. And they did need somebody in a very dynamic position. As I said, small wineries often need somebody to do a lot of different things. And so the deal was to work the summer with Andrea doing the tasting room and the wine club stuff in order to work harvest with Andrew in the fall. And that is kind of how that happened. And then started leaving the hemp thing behind, more committing to the wine. Worked harvest with Andrew, and then we had a moment at the end of that harvest, which was awesome. Totally different experience altogether. They're a very, very small winery. Mostly everything is estate. I think we did 35 tons or something like that. Really, really small. But the funny thing is not. At a very large winery, you have all this equipment to make things very efficient. At a small winery, you don't always have that, and so less tons of wine often is more work, right? So, 35 tons at that winery was almost the same amount of work as a couple hundred tons at a different winery, And then just working with Andrew, he has a very different approach to winemaking, very natural wine, super minimalist. Andrew's also a very, somebody really open to creative input, and so that was really cool. Got to work with him, take a very, very different perspective on wine. We did the harvest together. It went really well. Andrew also makes the amphora, the clay novum, as he calls them. And so that was like a totally different vessel I'd never worked with before, which is very cool. At the end of harvest, the moment comes where it's wintertime. Small wineries often don't have much going on in the winter, and it was told we could no longer employ you full time. And so I started to look for other jobs, circled back to Olivier at Petit Monde, and he was like, I got a job for you. You come do wine deliveries and warehouse management for me. And so then I was at one job for a very short period of time and then found myself back in 2 jobs again. And then in that time, my wife and I got married just prior to harvest. I love my wife. She's the perfect person in the world, but we had a lot of pressure on us because of visa and immigration status to make it happen really quick. And here's a big shout out to Ray Walsh. Ray and his wife Jen offered to host our wedding, and I will never forget, I had a moment at Capitello. Capitello is Ray's brand, where I was like setting up the patio and putting up the umbrellas in the morning, and this was like very late, right before going to New Zealand, but not yet knowing I was going to New Zealand, and just being like, man, what am I gonna do? I really hope one day I look back on this moment and kind of laugh. And I remember just like putting up the umbrella, and then the moment that came full circle was I got married at that place. And Ray and I had like built the patio outside together. I had painted the outside of the building. I had done a ton of work there, and it was a really like fulfilling moment to circle back and like have my family there and to get married at the place that I had put so much, love and energy into. And then to have Ray and Jen be the ones hosting it, that was like the coolest thing. So that was very, very generous of their part and very like fulfilling to see that come full circle. So yeah, coming back into harvest 2019, not sure I had a full-time position at Beckham, started working for Petit Monde, which was another brilliant experience because Olivier imports and distributes wine. And so you work in the domestic winemaking. You have a very, not necessarily tunnel vision, but like a very specific vision of wines. And when you're working in the tasting room, you're selling the wine that you make. And then all of a sudden I had this opportunity to see all this other wine that was being imported from France and Italy and taste with the wine reps. And some of the job was, just driving cases around, which was cool because we were still relatively new to Portland. And that was an awesome moment. Like, you drive to all the different restaurants, you're going to discover the neighborhoods. And, you learn your way around town. And you also get to meet people. Mm-hmm. And so that was not necessarily like the most glorious job I've ever had, but like it was so awesome for the people that I worked with and the access to wines that I had. And Olivier for, just being the person that he is and really keeping, understanding that, at some sense I was just a driver, but like knowing how important it was for everybody to be attached and involved in the overall operations, always including me in the tastings and making it a really valuable educational experience as well.
And then the pandemic hit.
And then my wife got pregnant. We didn't even make it a year before my wife was pregnant, which is awesome. So the pandemic hit, man, crazy. My wife was working a job. She is a pastry chef, has worked in like Michelin restaurants all over the world. Was working insane hours. Would get up at like 3:30 in the morning and finish at like 8 p.m. at night. And I was working. We were still new to the U.S., way in debt, super struggling. And she started to get like night sweats. And this was like right at the pandemic. So I think it was like the Thursday that before the world changed or whatever, and the business she was working for was like, we got to stop. Like, we're going to stop production. Everybody's got to go home next week. We don't know what we're doing. And then she was feeling sick, and it was like night sweats for a while. And so we went to the doctor. And this is right in the beginning of COVID, where like if you had a runny nose, you thought you were dying. And so we went to the doctor, thought that she was going for COVID, and they're like, you're pregnant. And that was not at all what we were thinking. And man, that was a moment of realizing, whatever we're doing right now, like it's really important that we like make the right decisions right now. And so I think that moment, for me, in what I was doing career-wise, particularly because my wife just lost her position, it was really important that I felt we were, making the right steps to build the life that we wanted to build. And so the Beckhams were awesome, kept me employed during COVID. Olivier at Petit Monde kept me employed during COVID. Awesome people, very generous. Another piece of winemaking, as I said, you got to do everything. The winery, we stopped doing tastings, so the wine that we were making, we continued to bottle and whatnot, but there wasn't nearly as many hours. And so Andrew had a construction project that he was working on for a family member, and I ended up just going to be the construction helper, and we built like a 3-story deck. And so that was another one of those funny ones of like, you want to be a winemaker, you wax the car, or you build a deck. And so yeah, stayed employed through that. Finally, just prior to harvest, I believe, man, all of this gets mixed up, but my son was due in November of 2020. And if you're a winemaker and you have a child due between August and November, it's rather problematic. And that also just happened to be the year of smoke. And so in a very selfish way, I was really happy that the smoke happened, because it greatly diminished harvest. It made things way shorter. It made it like feasible for me to think about having a child on the 16th of November. And so that was a very interesting harvest. I remember very distinctly in like the second week of September, I think that's when the smoke came in, and talking to Andrew, and he was like, I don't think we're gonna pick. And that is like, now with retrospect, was a reasonable thing to think, but at the time I was like unfathomable. Like, what do you mean we're not going to pick? What have we been doing for the last whole time, working on the vines and whatnot? And so we ended up making wine. We ended up selling a lot of wine as bulk wine. We were in the confines of natural winemaking, where you don't want to use a ton of products to manipulate and change, so it puts you in a really tough position for when you have things like smoke taint. And so very, very short harvest that year. The Beckhams were awesome in helping me get to a place where I could support my family. Olivier at Petit Monde was awesome to help me do that as well. And I think I continued working both jobs for another like 2 months after my son was born, and then I committed to being fully employed by Beckham Estate and leaving Petit Monde. And that was a very amicable depart from Petit Monde. I still have a very good relationship with Olivier to this day. I think that's how you've worked for good people, is when you quit and like you still have tons of love and respect, and like they actually, it's not that they wanted you to quit, but they're happy to see you commit to what you're doing. So that was a really cool position. And so continued to be full-time for the Beckhams from there. And then did harvest 2021, and was kind of getting to a point where working for a small winery can be difficult in that there is limits to growth. You can only produce so much wine, you can only sell so much wine, and you're in a position too where you're not the owner, you're the employee. And this is no disrespect at all to Andrew and Andrea. It becomes to a point where you are trying to grow and continue moving in your career, but you realize it's hard, and the business can't always grow to the level that you want to grow, and you have to have that sort of symmetry. And that was starting to happen right at a moment where I had another connection circle back. somebody I met years and years before who was a barrel rep and sold barrels and tanks, a French guy who imported wine or barrels and vessels from France, who approached me thanks to Ray and offered to interview me for a position as a barrel rep and a tanks importer. And so that all kind of was happening at the moment of thinking about, okay, what's next? And I ended up getting that job in like October of 2021, right during harvest, and it was kind of bittersweet to depart from the Beckhams because they had been there through a lot of really important parts of my life. But again, one of those moments where you've worked for good people when you leaving keeps you on good terms. And so one of the really cool pieces of the circle is that the company I work for now, Artisan Barrels and Tanks, actually represents Andrew's Novum. So we sell his amphora, which was a very cool way to keep the circle moving there. Yeah, wow, that's like a life story.
That's the whole goal here.
Yeah.
So you're doing, this is awesome.
Okay.
Tell me, with Artisan Barrels and Tanks specifically, what intrigued you about it? Something you had, something new. What was exciting about it for you?
Several pieces. One is working in proximity to production. You're in a very unique role, and this is, I think, one of the coolest parts about my job, where you can enter a wine cellar and speak with a winemaker and ask very intrusive questions, and they're really receptive of that. And like the better questions you ask, the more you build a relationship with the person and the more you actually solidify your role as their supplier. And so it's a really unique thing, and I find myself all the time kind of being amazed at this. But like I'll go to Okanagan in British Columbia and walk into this phenomenal winery and just like get the tour of the winery with the winemaker and just be like, man, how many people would flip to have this opportunity? And I just get to sit here and like, how much whole cluster did you use on that wine? Like, did you sulfur it at crush? Or all these questions that like for one winemaker to another winemaker maybe not in their best interest to answer, because it's not trade secrets necessarily, but it's important decision making procedures. But you're in a position where the more you develop that relationship with the person, the better help that you can be in supplying them the vessels that I have this access to these tools. You have your project. The better I understand your project, the better I can kind of suggest different tools that might be useful for your project. So that is really cool. The other huge piece here is the French connection. We work with French suppliers. Our owner is French. It's a very small company. We're 4 people total. The introductory period, they brought me over to France, or actually it was coinciding with a trip to France. My son had never met his French family. We got married and had a kid before we went back to France, so it had to happen. And it coincided with taking the new job to where I went and visited their cooperage in Burgundy, the concrete tank supplier in Burgundy, the stainless tank supplier in Bordeaux, and it was a very kind of it worked out really well. I was going to France anyway, and we made it a work/family trip. And yeah, now I get to work directly with these producers in France. We speak French at home. I think that probably helped get the job a little bit, but we work with the French suppliers. Yeah, it's a very, as I mentioned, a really unique position. And I think another piece to me, we're talking about like growth and trying to match yourself in a career, in a job where you can grow at the rate that you want to be with the rate of the business's growth. And it's a sales job, and it's about sales and commissions, and the more you sell, the better you do. And it's very linked to there's no cap to growth. There's no limit. If you sell 1 million barrels, you did a really good year. It's not like you can't sell a certain amount. If you outsell how much your supplier can produce, like, you did really well. And that's probably not going to happen. So yeah, it was an opportunity to use the knowledge that I had acquired from all these other opportunities in the production of wine, and then have an opportunity. I have a child now. I'm married. I have a wife and a family to support, and it was an opportunity to like help us reach the next step in our personal life. using the skills and tools and experiences that I had acquired during my past jobs.
I know you're still pretty new to the position.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I'm curious if it has altered or changed your perspectives on wine or winemaking at all yet.
Yeah, definitely has. I think we mentioned it, not to use the word tunnel vision because that's not the right word, but it's kind of in the realm of when you're in wine production and you're focused on your product and you're focusing on what you're trying to achieve in your goals, you do get very zoned in. And what's really interesting is to like get zoned out. And I have a very like macro view of things. In the past 3 months, I've like been, in the month of March, I was home for 7 days total, the whole entire month, and just visiting California, Washington, Canada, Oregon, obviously, and you just see a lot in a very, very short period of time, and you get a much more macro view. And I think both perspectives have their advantages, but it's just interesting to see a different perspective I didn't have prior. And then you also, you talk to different folks and you see different, like I mentioned, I have an opportunity to just talk directly to people and really get an understanding. And I think the more that, the more maybe that a customer or client can get from me, the more valuable I am too. So, if you learn something from somebody, you think it might be valuable to somebody else, you can be this kind of like vessel of information sharing. And, that's with all due respect to winemakers, because obviously there's some things that's proprietary and like, working with folks, you need to respect that and honor that. But also, just interesting. You get a very macro view. And then things where, working in like the not tiny, but the natural wine world of Oregon, there's certain wines that like, don't become villainized, but like become the inverse, and like not to knock California, but there's a lot of like wines from Napa that like, I think a lot of Oregon winemakers is like, that's not what we want to be. But it's interesting to go there and talk to those people doing those wines and learn why those wines are the way that they are. And I think, everything has value as long as, what do we say in this world? Things are worth what somebody's willing to pay for it, and as long as there's a market for those things, everything is valuable. The tiny, no intervention, natural 0.0 sulfur wine is just as valuable as like the 200% new oaked Napa Cabernet, and there's no, it's all about perspective and it's all about what you're looking for. And so I think it's helped me be a lot more diplomatic in my wine selection, if you will.
Diplomacy is important.
Diplomacy is very important, yes. Particularly in sales too, right? You have a goal, you're trying to sell somebody something, but if you come off too hard on it, and I've been on the other side of the table, been a winemaker meeting with a barrel rep too, and if you push something too hard, it loses its, you want it to be a collaborative scenario. You don't want it to be, how can I tell you what you need if I don't know what you do, right? It's an important, so this last year for me has been just trying to meet everybody, introduce myself, not change the recipe for anyone, but just learn, and try and establish relationships with people, because I think in anything you do, that's hugely important, right?
So with that in mind, having just gotten started and having the world sort of slowly opening back up into something like it used to be, what do you see as you look ahead for yourself, for the work you're doing and for potential other things down the road?
Yeah. Logistics, international logistics is like the big hot ticket right now, because we import things from Europe and things are more expensive than they've ever been to get them over in containers. Things take more time than ever. The price of logistics almost outweighs the price of products in certain scenarios, and it makes you like rethink what should be consumed and what's reasonable to be consumed. And I think like wine completely aside, that is a global issue that the current world is like addressing. And with COVID and whatnot, like supply chains got all wrinkled, demands skyrocketed in places they hadn't skyrocketed and sunk in other places. And it's a whole new entity of international business, but it's like really, really important. And you know, it affects many different things. Like you go to the grocery store, there's no avocados. Like that has to do with the supply chain. It's the same thing we're dealing with when we're trying to bring tanks over from France. Mm-hmm. You know, and it's the same thing that you know, if you're trying to furnish your new house and you just buy a couch and it takes 9 months, and you're like, how could it take 9 months to buy a couch? And you're like, well, actually, you know, it got produced over there, it got shipped to there, it got put on the boat here, sat outside of the port for 3 months here before it got, you know, there's a lot of pieces to the way we consume things, and that's an interesting thing. And wine is implicated just as everything is implicated in that.
So let's talk about Oregon a little bit. Tell me about your sort of initial impressions of Oregon wine in the industry, and how those impressions have changed, if they have, in the time you've been a part of it.
Yeah. So there's folks that have been in the Oregon wine industry way longer than I have. So I don't want to make any like big, well, in the lab, you know. But I will say, I find the Oregon wine industry to be really approachable and people to be super down to earth, and it's a very like give respect, get respect kind of scenario. And if you're you know, interested and willing to ask good questions and really listen, I think it's impressive to see how receptive winemakers and people who are like really, really influential in the industry, how approachable these people actually are. Mm-hmm. And you know, as I said, I've been to a bunch of different wine regions in the last couple months, particularly like in the crash course of the Pacific Northwest in Canada. And man, people in Oregon are just like really, really cool and genuine and approachable. And I think that is this like really distinct charm of what's happening here in Oregon. I also think the climate here, although it's getting warmer, is we can make really pretty wines. And there's a lot of wine regions that it's just really hot. It's really intense weather, and the wines don't quite have as much, maybe elegance isn't the right word, because you can make an elegant wine from anything, but not from bad grapes, but from super ripe grapes you can have an elegant wine as well. But delicate maybe. Yeah, we just have a really unique climate here in Oregon. It rains a ton. It's cool a lot of the year. In the summer it gets warm. There's a lot of diurnal shift most places in Oregon. Where in the New World there's no rules, right? You can grow whatever you want to grow anywhere. You can find Syrah in the Willamette Valley. You know, Gamay I think is this new kind of one that people are really paying a lot of attention to. There's no rules whatsoever for whites. You'll find Riesling next to Chardonnay, you know. Yeah, it's cool. I think Oregon has that kind of like a pioneer Northwest spirit, and I think you see it in the wine world. And you see a lot of people, like the Beckhams are a great example of just like, you know, somebody who has a skill set of ceramics and who gets enthralled with winemaking and can like cut their own path to make those things become one, and you know, to build a business around it. And I think the consumer culture here is very receptive to that as well. Where I think Oregon consumers are like, they really want something with a story, and they want to know how things were produced. And I think that curiosity is like what fuels the industry as being as unique as it is. That's not to say it's only in Oregon, right? There's a lot of other places that have that as well, but I think it's something that Oregon does really well.
So what about as you look ahead for the industry? What's coming next?
Yeah, I think whatever you want to call it, like changing temperatures, changing climates, whatever buzzword you want to put on it, like it's something that's being addressed in the wine industry right now, and it's like really important on people's minds. Like currently, right now, there's pretty grim crop estimates in Oregon. We had in April like a Thursday at 75 degrees, and then it snowed a couple inches on Sunday, and it was frosting and hailing that week, and it really did damage. It was right at bud break. So that's huge. I've heard, talked to a lot of different folks. I've heard estimates as bad as like 80% loss. I've heard people that are being rather optimistic about it, but like are acknowledging that like yields are going to be down. The fire in 2020 was a really big moment of like, whoa, I thought we were, avoiding all this. And that was also just like during COVID and whatnot. You're like, man, what else? what possibly? And then I had a funny conversation with Nathan Paddock, who is Andrew's assistant in the ceramics forming of the Novum Amphora. Really awesome ceramics artist, very, very good at what he does. And Nathan told me, he's like, don't ask that question. Don't ask what else, because you don't want to find out. And Nathan was very right in that. But yeah, it's important. I like difficulties to make things ripen where they used to ripen, being able to ripen grape varietals that never would have been considered in certain regions. California's in a perpetual drought. They're actually having a pretty good year right now. I think that is the contradiction of wine, is its nature and its man, and like you can have the man side of it all dialed, but like nature plays a really important role here too, and I think that is, it's connected to the earth, and if the earth is changing and not happy with what we're doing, then you're going to see it in the wines.
So now that you're in a role that you mentioned all the reasons you're excited about the role you're in, stability and it can have a way to build on your role. Do you have down the line thoughts of returning to production, returning to different parts of the wine industry?
Yeah, that's never a. Actually, when they offered me the job, they offered me to do it like part-time, half the year to do the sales, and then the other half of the year stay in production. But I have always worked multiple jobs, and the idea of having one job is really appealing to me. And I'm very thankful that happened the way it happened, because right now with logistics and whatnot, just following containers coming from Europe is like a full-time job. So that, yeah. It's interesting. My season right now slows down during harvest, and I think what I'm going to do is just like call up winemaker folk and just be like, can I come and do punch downs and clean tanks for you? I'm down with that too. Throw on the Carhartts for a day. I don't know. I love wine production. I love the industry. I don't see myself leaving it ever completely. Who knows? It's and the stability thing here is cool, but at the same time, we're supplying wine vessels for a volatile industry dependent on nature is not super stable either. There's good years and there's bad years, so it's like anything, nothing is guaranteed, right? You gotta find your way to navigate any, bumpy waters.
So if someone were to ask you for your advice or words of wisdom on joining in the Oregon wine industry, what would you tell them?
Yeah, go work a harvest. Just go work clean tanks, do the cellar work. And if you don't find joy in that kind of stuff, it's probably not the right industry for you, because that is really like the building blocks of everything, and yeah, it's as I said before, it's manual labor, but it's artistry, and you can't just be the winemaker who gets to present his wine at winemaker dinners and dress nice. You have to also be the one out there, crushing grapes and cleaning the press. And so I would say go work a harvest, go be a cellar rat somewhere, and if it pleases you, then you're probably in the right place. And if you don't like it and it's not your thing, then there's other auxiliary aspects of the industry. Like you can be an importer, you can be a wine rep. If you want to be in the production side, start by cleaning a tank. I think that's like that would be my 2 cents there.
Perfect. Well, that's all the questions that I have for you. Anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover that we should have covered today?
I think we owe a lot of respect to winemakers. I am now in an auxiliary role, and I'm not a producer, and I wouldn't have the position I have without that. And I think we also owe a lot of respect to folks that work in the vineyards. And I think, unfortunately, that is something that gets glossed over a lot of times. There's a lot of folks out there that work full-time in the vineyards that get very little or no credit whatsoever for the very, very difficult and extremely important work that they do. And it's a lot of Hispanic folk, it's a lot of Latin folk, it's a lot of people that, don't get don't reap the benefits of the glorification of wine. And I think, we need to look at things critically and understand that like it's a lot more than just the bottle that's in front of you. There's a lot of other pieces that played into it. And people who work in agriculture are crucial to our society in many, many different ways, and maybe deserve a little more credit than they get sometimes.
Well said. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your stories with us, sharing all your perspectives with us, and we'll let you off the hook.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Much appreciated.